Hey, I'm Tamara Kendacker, and you're listening to The Decibel from the Globe and Mail. On September 17th, more than 10,000 students walked out of class at Western University. This came after 4 sexual assaults were reported to police during the school's orientation week, and later other allegations started spilling out over social media. The atmosphere on campus has been tense, and now students, parents, and others are asking the administration to answer for its culture.
I've been talking to first-year girls in residence, just friends who are terrified to go to the bathroom at night if they're not in groups because their bathrooms are outside of their bedrooms. And it's just a very different atmosphere around campus right now. There's a lot of fear.
That's Hope Mahood, a coordinating editor at Western's student newspaper, the Western Gazette. She's been reporting on the story with Joe Friesen, the Globe's postsecondary education reporter. They're both on the show today, and we're going to talk about the culture at Western and what the response to this month's events tells us about the attitudes around campus sexual assault. That's today on The Decibel. Hi, Joe. Hi, Hope. Thanks so much for being here and taking the time to speak with me.
Hi.
Thank you for having us.
So, Joe, for people who haven't been following this, last week was orientation week at Western, and I want to start with what happened on the night of September 10th. Can you take me through what happened that night?
So the night of September 10th was the night that there was some kind of gathering at the Medway-Sydenham Hall on the campus of the University of Western Ontario in London, Ontario. And there are still many questions about what happened that night. The first reports that we had that anything had gone wrong came via social media. And in those cases, we were hearing that many students had been potentially drugged and in some cases potentially sexually assaulted. And there was a lot of upset, naturally, about those circumstances. And over the course of the next few days, police began to investigate some of those claims. The university did as well. And students, I think, were understandably quite upset about it. And this movement began to try to get the university to address some of the issues around campus culture and the activities that go on during orientation week that led to a campus walkout last Friday.
And separate from this, there have also been 4 cases of sexual assault reported to police.
Yeah, that's right. There were 4 cases of sexual assault at the university involving students that were reported to police, but those came before the events at Medway-Sydenham Hall. And separately, there was another tragic incident unconnected to these involving the death of a first-year student, Gabriel Neal, who had just arrived in London not too long before and was killed in an altercation near campus.
And none of these incidents, the 4 reported sexual assaults, the allegations of drugging and sexual assault on social media, and the student's death, as far as we know, are linked, right?
That's right. As far as we know, none of them are linked, but it's many things to come in a very short period of time on one campus. And I think it's fair to say that it really caused a huge amount of upset at Western.
And Hope, tell me how this all unfolded on social media.
So I think the first social media post I saw was a girl on TikTok posting a video, and it was a very plain video of her just looking at her screen and with a text caption on it. It was posted Saturday morning, and it said, "What happened at Western University last night?" So I initially clicked on this video that showed up on my feed and scrolled through the comment section, and I was assuming it was about some of the wild parties we've been having earlier in the week on our Brochdale Avenue. And I scrolled through the comments and I saw, just as Joe said, these allegations that a number of students in Medway-Sydenham had been drugged and possibly sexually assaulted. I then saw the numbers started off rather small, kind of mid-teens, and then throughout the day, as it migrated to Instagram and then Twitter, the numbers slowly got bigger as potentially more people came forward and talked about it, or just as social media picked up on the story and began to build it.
And Joe, you mentioned that police have started their own investigation into this, even though there hasn't been a complaint. And I was just wondering if that is normal. Do we normally see police investigating allegations being made on social media?
The police in this case said because of the volume of reports they were seeing on social media and the nature of the allegations, which were so concerning, of drugging and sexual assault, that they began their investigation right away of their own accord. Normally, you would expect them to have a complainant. So with a complaint, then they then have a cause to investigate. But in this case, it was Monday or Tuesday night, I think they were canvassing door to door in Medway Sydenham Hall because they were really concerned about getting on top of this investigation as quickly as possible. Now, since then, we have not heard anything from police about anyone further coming forward. But the police don't always tell us when they have a lead in an investigation. So there may be things going on behind the scenes we don't know about.
And you kind of touched on this at the beginning, but what has happened on campus since September 10th? What's been the reaction from the university?
The reaction on campus was really remarkable and swift. Students immediately seemed to indicate that this was not something they were going to put up with. And so the walkout that was eventually took place on Friday was announced very soon after, and it gathered a lot of support very quickly. So it was clear that students were going to respond to these allegations more quickly even than the university administration. Administrators were also concerned. They were trying to figure out what had happened here, but it took them a few days, I think, to get their response together, whereas students were ready to march out of class within a day or two.
Yeah, and I just want to add on to that walkout. It was entirely student organized. So it was a group of, I believe it was 25 students in the end who'd met over social media. So I believe Reddit and Facebook were the main ones. And they all had this idea individually to start this walkout protest, and they joined together and decided to coordinate it online.
And you were there, right? What was that like, and what were students asking for?
It was probably the largest gathering I've seen on campus in my 4 years here, and definitely the largest gathering that was demanding something and pushing the university administration for something rather than, say, a massive party on Brofdale.
Yeah.
I think there were two main purposes of it. The first one being to stand with survivors. So I think a large reason was to show them that they're not alone. And I think the second reason was to demand more swift action from the university. So many students on campus were terrified when these first reports started coming out. I've been talking to first-year girls in residence, just friends who are terrified to go to the bathroom at night if they're not in groups because their bathrooms are outside of their bedrooms. And it's just a very different atmosphere around campus right now. There's a lot of fear. So I think that walkout was to kind of show the fear the community is feeling, that the students are taking it seriously and they want to see as serious a response from the administration.
And what has been the response from the administration so far?
So the day before the walkout, the administration did release a set of action plans that they were going to be taking immediately to change things on campus. So the first one being that they were going to up campus security in a variety of areas. They were going to have more safety ambassadors in residence buildings. They were going to have more campus police officers. And they were also going to have mandatory sexual violence training for all first-year students in residence, which is an interesting point because earlier in their press releases, they were talking about how they mandated extensive sexual violence training for all first-year students. The thing is, when you start talking to students about what this mandatory extensive sexual violence training looked like during their orientation, I guess you could say it's a virtual training. So they were shown an online video, they were sent a link by their student leaders, but there was no checks and balances about whether they actually sat through this video, clicked on the link, attended.
And I assume that this was because of COVID, that this training is happening online versus in person?
Yes. We did have some rather large concerts at night, though.
But I think it's also very expensive to provide in-person training for thousands of students. To me, the university initiative to make this training mandatory and in person, and they're starting with first-year students in residence, but they say they're going to extend it to the entire campus, which is a major, major initiative. I don't know if there's anything comparable in terms of size and scope at other Canadian universities.
But I imagine this orientation week was also really different in other ways because of COVID restrictions. And so what were the rules that were in place? Hope, maybe you take that one.
So many of our faculty softs were not allowed into residence buildings this year. So during a normal year, so when I was a first-year student, we had residence softs and faculty softs, and everyone would be allowed into our residence building with us, these student leaders, to kind of hang out with us, but also informally monitor for things like drinking and large gatherings and parties inside the residences where things tend to get out of hand. This year with COVID, there were two important things at play with softs. First off, faculty softs were not allowed inside the residence buildings. So you just have fewer authority figures inside the residence overall. Second off, you have the resident softs who were allowed inside the buildings, but unlike when I was a first year and unlike when most people were first years at Western, they weren't living inside the residences with the students. They were living in off-campus housing because in the spring, Western announced that no upper year students would be living in residence buildings in order to up the capacity of our residence buildings. So in order to make that happen, our resident softs had to take rooms off campus, which means they are no longer living with the first year students they are meant to be supports for.
So just so I'm clear, that means that these first year students living away from home for the first time are basically just on their own in these residences with not a lot of supervision.
They would still have their dons and RAs and resident staff around, but you don't have those softing figures who are just so much greater in number. There's so many more of them living in residence typically, and they're a much more informal authority figure. Their role is really meant to be a big brother, big sister relationship rather than an authority figure enforcing rules.
So when I was a student, Western had a reputation for being a party school. This is something that you still hear, pretty often about that campus. And I wonder, how do you think what is alleged to have happened on September 10th fits into the wider culture on the Western campus?
Well, I think even decades ago, Western had a reputation for being a party school. And I can remember when people I knew were looking at universities to attend, one of the points in favor in their minds or against in the minds of some others was the party scene. Mm-hmm. It's interesting to hear the university president, Alan Shepard, this week talking about the need to interrupt some of the ways that people understand the Western culture. For a university president to say there's something wrong with the culture on his own campus, to me really stands out because that's not something you hear very often. And it signals that there is a real desire to tackle something there. And when I asked him to put his finger on it, what is it about the culture that needs to change? The first thing he said was the parties. Students need to realize that they are not here primarily for the partying. And of course, many great students come from Western, lots of great academics there. But the first couple of weeks of school, I think, have a big focus on the social gatherings, and that can bring with it some problems. The president also talked about wanting to interrupt the narratives of masculinity on campus, which was, kind of an interesting concept that you wouldn't have heard, I think, from university presidents even a few years ago. But the way that young men are behaving on campus clearly is something that he thinks needs to be addressed.
And I guess I would put this to both of you. Is there something that makes Western's culture unique from other universities?
I don't know that it's unique. I think there are other universities that have campus cultures that are similar to Western's. One of the things that came up in the research was there was a study of sexual assaults on campus in the last few years. And 1 in 3 students at Western in 2017-18 reported being the victim of sexual assault, which was towards the highest end of the study and about 10 points higher than the average for Ontario universities. Now, one thing that study did caution about making comparisons from one campus to another, because there would be some issues in how people report in different places and how the samples were collected. But there certainly is some kind of indication in research like that there may be something at Western that's worth examining more deeply. And I think that's what we've heard from people on campus, faculty who've been there for decades, from students who've been there for a few years in these last few days, is that many people feel there's something in the campus culture that needs to be changed. So that's what they're calling for.
And Joe, that study, did the university do anything in response to it?
I think over the last few years, the university has taken a number of steps to, for example, make reporting somewhat easier on students. That study that I mentioned contributed to an Ontario government initiative to push universities to make reporting of sexual violence easier and to ban universities from putting complainants in situations where they might be in some jeopardy for violating codes of conduct, or also prevented university officials from asking about irrelevant matters like sexual history or something like that in the course of an investigation. So I think Western would be in that camp with the majority of other universities in having taken steps to try to address some of these issues that students have raised.
I keep thinking about how these students are first years, and I wonder how parents are reacting to this. Joe, I know you've had some conversations with parents. What are they saying and what are they asking for?
The parents that have spoken to me are really upset. They expressed a lot of disappointment in the university. They thought this was not at all what they were getting themselves into. One parent mentioned going through the bill of what she had paid to the university. There was obviously the thousands you pay in tuition and thousands you pay for residence. And then there were the smaller itemized numbers for student safety, the foot patrol, the et cetera, et cetera. And she said, higher education talks about itself as a business a lot these days, but that in this case, the university needs to recognize that the product it's selling is defective. And so there was some, real talk about wanting to see the administration take responsibility for a problem that is not just a month or two in the making. This is years of, as the president has identified it, an issue to do with culture on campus.
So I was reading this interesting piece in The Conversation about orientation weeks, and there is research that shows that women of university age are at high risk of sexual assault, particularly in the first weeks after arriving on campus. And there's research that links orientation weeks, which tend to involve a lot of drinking and stuff like that, and incidents of sexual and gender-based violence. And there are some people, like the person who wrote this piece for The Conversation, who argue that these events should just be canceled. And Hope, what do you think of that? And is that a conversation that's happening on campus?
That's so funny, because I was actually sitting in my student newsroom this morning reading that piece with a group of my coworkers and discussing that. And I think what we kind of realized amongst ourselves was that that's not going to be effective. Canceling a week, proclaiming a dry campus, that's a really nice fantasy, but that's never going to work in reality. Because ultimately, just by canceling sanctioned on-campus activities, you're not going to cancel this concept of orientation for students. All you have to do is look at Western's homecoming. So back about 5 years ago, the administration moved Western's homecoming from its late September date to mid-November. The theory being this is in the middle of midterms. Students won't want to party in the middle of midterms when it's cold outside. They'll just stay inside and keep it to rather low-key affairs. Instead, students created this thing called fake homecoming, FOCO, on the original last week in September, and gathered in numbers never before seen on homecoming in a completely unsanctioned giant street party on Brofdale Avenue. And what made it worse is it was completely unsanctioned. The university was diverting no resources to it, so there was no extra security, and all became put on the local London police force to control this giant fake homecoming event. So Western ended up having to run what was called a Purple Fest, which was on-campus programming to divert students from Brofdale, and essentially ended up running, for lack of a better term, 2 homecomings. So I think we know that canceling orientation week isn't going to work, especially because every other university would continue to have orientation week, and you'd have these kids coming straight out of high school, coming to university, feeling left out and feeling like they need to post something akin to what their friends are posting on their Instagrams.
So what do you think then would make these orientation weeks safer?
I think from talking to students, they would like more training, like what the university is now mandating for students and residents. I think they'd like to see that part of the orientation week and mandatory like it was when I was in first year. I think they want to see not only consent training, but also bystander training, because I think most people would acknowledge the fact that if you sit a guy down who's going to do something like drug a girl or sexually assault someone, sitting them down for an hour-long consent training probably isn't going to change their entire opinion on women or their intention to do that. But maybe sitting down a group of first-year students who have friends in first year who are going to be vulnerable at these events, sitting them down and explaining, here are the warning signs, here's what you can do to get your friend out of that situation, here are steps you can take if you are in that situation. We don't like to put that on the victim, but I think doing the bystander training to explain actions people witnessing these events can take to maybe prevent something horrible from happening might actually have a tangible effect on campus, while the administration and everyone can focus on a broader cultural shift.
Gotcha. And Joe, last question for you. What lessons do you think other universities can learn from what's been happening at Western?
Well, I think other universities would look at this and see what Western has brought in response to a terrible series of events and think maybe we ought to do that proactively. And so we will see if Western's model ends up being something that is followed everywhere. Sometimes a crisis can produce good policies and sometimes not. So I think it still remains to be seen. As far as, lessons to learn from it, I think listening to the students would be one that all campuses would do well to do, because it really was the students in this case who led the movement that got the university to respond so quickly and comprehensively.
Okay, Joe, Hope, thank you both so much. Really appreciate this.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
And that's it for today. I'm Tamara Kandaker. Our producers are Madeline White, Cheryl Sutherland, and Kasia Mihailovich. Michal Stein helped produce this episode. David Crosby edits the show. Angela Pacenza is our executive editor. Thank you so much to Joe Friesen and Hope Mahood. You can find more of Joe's work at theglobeandmail.com, and Hope is on Twitter at Hope Mahood. If you want to reach us, you can email us at thedecibel@globeandmail.com. If you want to reach me, I'm on Twitter at anima_TK. If you haven't already, hit that follow button wherever you're listening so you never miss an episode. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.